The prisoner of Kareth Station. The asteroid smelled like iron and old suffering. Kareth Station was not built for beauty. It was built for extraction, a skeletal ring of metal and pressurized corridors bolted onto a dead rock 3 light-years from the nearest human colony. The Vorkai operated it with mechanical efficiency, processing rare minerals for their empire while their prisoners did the dying slowly in the lower tunnels. Commander Sasha Novak had been there for 11 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. She knew the count because she scratched it into the wall beside her bunk every morning before the guards ran their shift check. It was the only act of defiance left to her. The Vorkai had taken everything else, her ship, her crew, her rank insignia. They had left her the uniform because it amused them. Humans and their symbols, the chief warden once said through the translation module mounted at his throat. Symbolic creatures. Fragile and sentimental. He was not wrong about the sentiment. He was very wrong about the fragile part. Sasha had been captured during the first contact incident near the Zephyr corridor, a catastrophic misunderstanding where her diplomatic vessel drifted too close to a Vorkai territorial beacon. They fired without challenge. She survived because the emergency pod ejected automatically. 3 of her crew did not survive. She thought about Lieutenant Okafor every day. His laugh. The way he could calculate orbital trajectories in his head while simultaneously eating a meal. Gone in 2 seconds of directed plasma. The Vorkai did not understand grief. They processed loss mathematically. Reduction of operational capacity, the warden called it when Sasha wept during her first week. She had stopped weeping in front of them after that. She did her grieving in the scratches on the wall. What she did not stop doing was observing. 11 months was a long time to watch. She learned the patrol rotations. She learned which guards grew bored at hour 3 and which ones were genuinely vigilant. She learned that the Vorkai's translation modules had a half-second lag, which meant in high-stress moments they processed language slightly slower than they processed threat. She learned that their thermal vision was extraordinary but their acoustic hearing was poor. They communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns on their thorax, which meant sound-based distractions were almost absurdly effective. She was not planning an escape. Not yet. She was planning something more important. She was collecting intelligence. On the 342nd day something changed. A new prisoner arrived, not human but Vorkai adjacent. A Selhari, one of the tributary species the Vorkai had absorbed centuries ago. Small, 4-armed, with translucent skin that shifted color with emotion. This one arrived terrified, skin cycling rapidly between white and pale gold. They threw him into the cell adjacent to Sasha's. The dividing wall had a ventilation gap near the floor, wide enough for sound, not wide enough for hands. "Hey," she said softly, pressing her face near the gap. "I won't hurt you." The Selhari made a sound like wind through broken glass. Distress. "I know you can't understand me," she continued. "But I need you to know you're not alone." She kept talking. Simple words. Consistent tone. She told him about Earth. Not the political Earth, not the military Earth, but the small Earth. Forest rain. The way coffee smelled in the morning. She didn't know if any of it translated, but the Selhari's skin gradually shifted from terrified white to something closer to dim amber. Not safe, but less afraid. His name, she eventually learned through patient pantomime and the partial translation capacity of her confiscated communicator, which she had secretly reassembled from salvaged components over 6 months, was something that sounded approximately like Tur. Tur had been a communications technician aboard a Selhari merchant vessel. He had data. Navigation data. Trade route data. The kind of data that, in the right hands, could map the entire Vorkai border network. And here was the thing about humans that the Vorkai had fundamentally failed to understand. Sasha Novak was not trying to escape for herself. She was trying to get Tur out. The plan took 3 weeks to execute. It involved a carefully induced power fluctuation in the mineral processing unit. She'd spent 2 months learning enough about the station's electrical system to manage it, a distraction involving a deliberately triggered alarm in the eastern tunnel, and a ventilation route she had mapped entirely from memory through 11 months of careful listening to air currents. On the night she moved, the Vorkai chief warden was reviewing quarterly extraction reports. His guards were rotating. The east alarm was screaming. Sasha pulled Tur through the ventilation shaft by his upper arms, moving fast and silent, the way she had trained recruits back at the academy. Stay low. Stay quiet. Trust the plan. They reached the docking bay at 0347 station time. There was a Selhari cargo shuttle in berth 7. Tur had told her, painstakingly over days of halting communication, that it arrived every 43 days for mineral pickup. It was due to depart in 6 hours. They were in the cargo hold within 4 minutes. Sasha did not sleep during those 6 hours. She sat with her back to the crates, Tur curled beside her with his skin slowly brightening to a pale, grateful green, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about Okafor. She thought about what she was going to tell them when she got back. Not about her capture. Not about the 11 months. She was going to tell them about the Vorkai's patrol patterns, their sensory weaknesses, their territorial beacon placement, their prisoner intake protocols. She was going to tell them about every cell she had heard. Every name scratched into walls by hands that were not human. Every species that wept in frequencies she couldn't always hear but always felt. The shuttle departed on schedule. The Vorkai never checked the cargo hold. As the stars stretched and Kareth Station shrank to a pale dot and then nothing, Sasha Novak finally allowed herself one quiet, private moment of something that was not grief and not triumph but the thin, fierce thing that lived between them. Humanity had one survivor out. And humanity was going to come back for everyone else. She began composing her report in her head. Not a rescue request. Not a plea. A plan. A very thorough, very detailed, very human plan. The Vorkai would not understand what was coming. They never understood the thing that made humans dangerous. Not their weapons, not their technology, not their numbers. It was this: humans did not abandon people. Not their own. Not strangers. Not beings they had known for 3 weeks through a ventilation gap. Sasha Novak pressed her hand flat against the cold hull of the shuttle and made a silent promise to every scratched wall and every unnamed prisoner she had left behind. We are coming back, she thought. Every last one of you. We are coming back. The Admiral's decision. The holographic map of Vorkai space hung above the briefing table like a bruise, deep purple territorial markers bleeding into contested gray zones, and at the center of it all, a cluster of red dots that Admiral James Osei could not stop staring at. Prisoner sites. Confirmed. 47 of them. Commander Novak sat across from him, looking like she had been reassembled from spare parts and determination. 11 months in a Vorkai mining station had carved her face into something leaner and more precise. Her eyes moved the way trained intelligence officers' eyes moved, always cataloging, always calculating exit routes. She had been speaking for 2 hours. Osei had not interrupted once. The Selhari data confirms it, she said, pressing a command into the table interface. 6 new sites bloomed red across the map. There are at minimum 43 non-human species currently held across Vorkai detention infrastructure. Unknown human prisoners. We lost contact with 3 survey teams in the Zephyr corridor in the last 18 months. They could be in any of these facilities. Osei leaned forward. Could be. Will be, Novak corrected quietly. The Vorkai don't leave witnesses. If they captured our people, they kept them. They study prisoners. They extract information and then they extract labor. The room was silent. Around the table sat 14 officers representing every branch of the United Earth Federation's military command. Political advisors. Fleet captains. The head of Xenodiplomatic Affairs, a small exhausted woman named Dr. Ewan who had aged a decade since the Zephyr incident. Dr. Ewan was the first to speak. Admiral, we need to consider the diplomatic implications. The Vorkai have not formally acknowledged any state of conflict. If we launch military operations. They shot down a diplomatic vessel, Novak said. Her voice was completely flat. Without provocation. Without challenge. They killed 3 members of my crew and imprisoned me for 11 months. At what point do we stop calling that a diplomatic implication? When we're ready to fight the war that follows, Ewan said. Silence. Osei looked at the red dots. 47 sites. He thought about the reports he had read over the past decade, the pattern of Vorkai expansion, slow and patient and merciless. A species that operated on long time scales. They had been absorbing tributary civilizations for centuries, not through conquest but through economic strangulation followed by strategic capture of populations. They turned species into labor forces, then into data sets, then into extinct footnotes. They had done it to the Selhari. They were doing it to a dozen others. And they were, Osei now understood, beginning to do it to humanity. Here is what I know, he said, and the table went quiet in the way tables went quiet when an admiral used that particular tone. I know that we have evidence of at least 47 detention facilities operating in what the Vorkai call their sovereign territory. I know that our people, are likely in some of those facilities right now. I know that we have been deliberating for 18 months while people are being processed in asteroid belt mining stations. He paused. He let that land. And I know, he continued, that if I do nothing, and in 2 years some other commander comes back with the same report with more red dots and more names and more scratches on walls, I will not be able to look any of them in the eye. Dr. Yuan clasped her hands. The political reality. The political reality, Osei said, is that we have a window. Commander Novak's intelligence gives us something no one has ever had before. Interior knowledge of Vorkai patrol schedules, sensory vulnerabilities, detention protocols. That window closes the moment they realize she escaped and figure out what she took with her. We have, at best, 60 days before their entire detention network rotates protocols. Captain Yashida of the Fifth Fleet spoke up. What exactly are you proposing, Admiral? Osei turned to face the map fully. He reached out and pressed a single command. The 47 red dots began to pulse in a synchronized pattern, grouped by distance, by patrol schedule, by the vulnerability data Novak had spent 11 months collecting. I'm proposing Operation Homecoming, he said. Coordinated simultaneous extraction across all confirmed sites. Every team goes in at the same time. The Vorkai can't reinforce what they can't predict. We hit them everywhere at once. The room erupted. Objections, questions, logistics concerns, political warnings. Osei let it run for 90 seconds, then raised one hand. Silence again. I want volunteers only, he said. I will not order anyone into Vorkai space. I want crews who understand what we're doing and why. He paused. We are not starting a war. We are ending a crime. He looked at Commander Novak, who was watching him with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite hope but something fragile living between the two. You said the Selhari, Tur wants to help, Osei said. He's already started translating the navigation data, she confirmed. He says there are others like him across the network. Former communications technicians, engineers. People who know these stations from the inside. He's been reaching out through channels I don't fully understand yet. Selhari have their own covert networks the Vorkai never properly mapped. Can he coordinate with them? He already is. Osei allowed himself one moment of something that might have been satisfaction. Then he turned back to his officers. We have 60 days, 47 targets, and apparently, an entire underground resistance network we didn't know existed 3 weeks ago. He looked around the table. Anyone who thinks this is impossible is free to leave. No one left. Yashida started pulling up fleet coordinates. The logistics officer was already calculating fuel loads. Even Dr. Yuan had opened a tactical briefing screen, her political objections set aside in the face of something that looked undeniably like a plan. Osei returned to the window overlooking the lunar surface. Earth hung in the distance, blue and patient. He thought about every war humanity had ever fought. The ones of territory. The ones of ideology. The ones of fear and pride and resource. This one was different. This one was simple. This one was, we do not leave people behind. We never have. We never will. It was written so deep into the human genome that it no longer required justification. It was not policy. It was not strategy. It was who they were. Begin planning, he said without turning around. We launch in 58 days. Behind him, the room ignited into motion. 47 red dots pulsed on the map like hearts. Every last one, Osei thought. Every last one. The underground. Tur had not slept properly in 40 days. This was not unusual for him. Selhari physiology allowed for a kind of distributed rest, a rolling semi-consciousness that could sustain a body through extended periods of alertness. What was unusual was the reason. For the first time in his adult life, Tur was not afraid. He was busy. Station Murith existed in a way that was difficult to explain to species who had not grown up under Vorkai sovereignty. It was not hidden exactly. It appeared on all the correct navigation charts as a legitimate way station for merchant traffic along the inner Vorkai trade corridor. It paid its Vorkai tariffs on time. Its docking logs were impeccable. Its surface was, by every observable metric, exactly what it claimed to be. Beneath that surface was something the Vorkai had never been able to conceptualize because they had never needed to, a people's network. The Vorkai understood hierarchy. They understood tributary relationships, data extraction, resource allocation. They did not understand the kind of lateral, organic, trust-based communication infrastructure that a species built when it spent 3 centuries being systematically suppressed. They did not understand it because they had never had to survive anything. The Selhari had survived everything. The network had no formal name. The humans who had discovered its existence through Tur and were now, with characteristic directness, trying to formalize a relationship with it, had started calling it the web. Tur found this both accurate and charming. Humans named things immediately. They named their ships, their stations, their plans. They named problems as a method of containing them. It was a fascinating cognitive habit. He was thinking about this as he reviewed the latest data burst from his contact at Kareth Station, a Selhari sanitation worker named Hess who had been feeding him guard rotation updates for the past 3 weeks. Hess's information, combined with 17 other sources across 9 different detention facilities, was being compiled into something that the Human Admiral's planning team was calling an operational intelligence package. Ter understood what this meant. He had been a communications technician. He knew what intelligence packages preceded. The humans were coming. The realization still moved through him in waves of something his people called Ketha real, roughly translated, the feeling of a door opening in a wall you had stopped believing had doors. When Commander Novak had pressed her face to that ventilation gap and spoken to him in a language he didn't know, in a tone he understood completely, Ter had been in the deepest pit of despair he had ever known. He had been separated from his crew, processed through the Vorkai intake system, which treated living beings with the same administrative indifference applied to mineral shipments, and placed in a cell that smelled of rust and other people's fear. And then this human had spoken to him about rain. He still didn't know why she chose that. Rain was apparently a weather phenomenon on humanity's homeworld, water falling from clouds which Selhari had no direct equivalent for. But the way she said the word, slow and careful, like she was handing him something fragile and valuable, had communicated more than any translation module could have managed. "I see you," it said. "I know you're suffering. I'm here." Ter had spent the subsequent weeks in furious internal debate about whether this was manipulation. He had concluded it was not, because manipulation required the manipulator to want something, and Novak had consistently, demonstrably, wanted nothing except his survival and eventual freedom. This was, in his experience, unusual enough to be significant. Now he sat at the communications core of Murith Station's hidden lower level, surrounded by 17 other members of the web, Selhari, 2 Dravathi, 1 ancient Keth who had been resisting Vorkai expansion since before Ter was born, and coordinated the most ambitious covert operation in 3 centuries of Vorkai suppression. The plan was elegant in the way that only things built by committee across multiple species could be elegant. Chaotically, improbably, and with an almost miraculous number of moving parts that somehow all pointed in the same direction. 47 sites. Simultaneous extraction. Human teams hitting the exterior while web agents disrupted interior systems. Communications, guard rotations, cell locks. The Vorkai command network would be blinded for approximately 12 to 18 minutes, which the humans had calculated was enough time to extract and reach jump distance. 12 minutes is aggressive, said Davin, the older of the 2 Dravathi. He had 4 eyes and the permanent expression of someone who had been disappointed by timelines before. "Our disruption window assumes the Vorkai don't compensate for the Kareth patrol gap." "They won't," said Ter. He pulled up the relevant data. The patrol gap was introduced 18 months ago as a budget measure. The guards who originally flagged it as a security concern were reassigned. No one currently in command knows it exists. He paused. "I know it exists because the guard who flagged it complained about it to the sanitation team for 6 months before his reassignment. The Vorkai assumes sanitation workers are beneath information gathering." The night of 47. The thing about silence in space was that it wasn't. Sergeant Amara Cole's dropship moved through the void with its drive signature masked and its running lights dark, and around it, unseen but present, 46 other teams were doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment across a volume of space larger than the entire solar system. The operation was 12 minutes old. Amara had the site schematic memorized. Facility 7 Delta, a mid-size installation on the 3rd moon of a gas giant the Vorkai called Haritha's Eye. 8 guard rotations. 42 confirmed prisoners. Unknown species breakdown, but web intelligence indicated at least 1 human biosignature in Block C. Possibly more. 90 seconds to contact, said her pilot, Lieutenant Rowe, from the front compartment. Rowe had the voice of someone who remained calm by choice rather than by nature. There was always a slight edge to it, like a knife that had been very deliberately set down on a table rather than thrown. Amara turned to her team. 7 people, all volunteers, all briefed, all carrying the specific equipment that Commander Novak's intelligence had identified as optimal for Vorkai structural vulnerabilities. Sonic disruptors. Cheap, non-lethal, and catastrophically effective against beings whose primary communication was bioluminescent. Thermal deflectors. Cell interface units built to Ter's specifications for overriding Vorkai lock systems. No one was carrying anything they weren't prepared to use. No one was carrying anything heavier than necessary. This was not a combat mission. This was a rescue. The distinction mattered to Amara. It had mattered to her since the first briefing, when Admiral Osei had said, with the specific quiet emphasis that separated genuine statements from rhetorical ones, "We are not here to punish. We are here to retrieve." 30 seconds, Rose said. The web disruption hit at exactly the scheduled moment. Amara felt it as a kind of negative, the absence of the low background transmission signal that the Vorkai used for guard coordination suddenly gone. Her comm suite registered the gap and auto-confirmed. Web active, disruption holding, window open. 12 minutes. Go. The dropship hit the docking port and Amara was moving before the seal fully pressurized. Her team flowed through the airlock in practice sequence. Chin first with the sonic emitter, then Vasquez with the cell interface kit, then the rest in pairs. Amara came last because that was where the sergeant went. The first Vorkai guard they encountered was at the intersection of the main corridor and the processing wing. He was a large one, carapace gleaming dull blue under the facility lights, and his bioluminescent patterns were firing in something Amara's translation badge rendered as alarm. Chin fired the sonic disruptor. The Vorkai guard dropped immediately, not dead. The sound was specifically calibrated to overwhelm their limited acoustic processing. Simply, paused. He'd be conscious and mobile again in approximately 8 minutes. Clear, Chin said. They moved. Block C was deeper than the schematic suggested. The web intelligence had indicated structural modifications made after the original surveys, additions that the Vorkai hadn't logged in any accessible database. Someone had been trying to hide this wing. Amara noted this with a cold, professional attention that she filed away for her report and kept moving. The cells were standard Vorkai design, efficient, bare, illuminated by a greenish light that seemed specifically chosen to emphasize hopelessness. Amara had seen photos. The reality was worse. There was a smell she would never be able to fully describe. Industrial cleaning compounds over something older and more organic. The smell of places where people had been kept for a very long time. Vasquez was at the first cell interfacing with the lock. The system clicked, chimed in Vorkai script and denied. He entered the override code TERS people had provided. A pause, 2 seconds that felt considerably longer, and then the cell released. The being inside was not human. It was Dravathi, one of the four-eyed species Ter had mentioned. It stared at Amara with all 4 eyes in what she was fairly certain was the specific expression of someone who has been waiting so long they had stopped believing waiting would ever end. "We're here to get you out," Amara said. Her translation badge converted it into Dravathi standard. "Can you walk?" The Dravathi stood. Slowly. But it stood. "Yes," it said through the badge. "I can walk." They moved through Block C systematically. Vasquez on locks, Chin on cover, the rest managing the growing group of freed prisoners. 12 Dravathi, 7 Selhari, 3 beings Amara didn't recognize and whose species designation her badge couldn't fully parse. And then, at the very end of the block in a cell that was notably more reinforced than the others, 2 humans. They were alive. They were not in good condition. But they were alive. The older of the 2, a man with a survey team insignia barely readable on his worn collar, grabbed Amara's arm when she came through the door. His grip was stronger than she expected. "Survey Team Gamma," he said immediately like he'd been rehearsing it. "We've been here 14 months. There are other humans. I heard them 3 weeks ago in the East Wing." "We know," Amara said. "East Wing is Team Beta's target. They're there right now." She met his eyes directly, deliberately. "We've got everyone. Every site. All at once." The man stared at her for a moment. His mouth moved but no sound came out. "All at once," he said finally. "All at once," she confirmed. They had 7 minutes left in the window when Amara counted her group at the docking port. 31 freed prisoners. Her 7 team members. Everyone moving, everyone conscious, the Dravathi and Selhari helping carry the 2 humans who couldn't walk independently. Vasquez was the last through the airlock. He paused at the threshold and turned back for one moment, looking down the corridor at the row of now open cells, empty and lit by that terrible greenish light. "Vasquez," Amara said. "Move." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'm moving." The dropship was gone from the facility before the first Vorkai guard recovered enough to report. Across 46 other locations, in that same 12-minute window the same thing was happening. Teams of volunteers, armed with intelligence built from 11 months of scratches on a wall and 3 centuries of a people's quiet resistance, moving fast and certain through facilities that had believed themselves untouchable. The Vorkai would report it later as a coordinated terrorist action. They would use the language of law and sovereignty in violation of territorial integrity. What they would not say because they did not have the conceptual framework for it was the truth. They had taken one human, and humanity had decided that was not something that could stand. Not one. Not 47. Not one species. Not any number. You take one of ours, Amara thought as the dropship burned hard toward the extraction point and 31 freed beings breathed recycled air in the hold behind her. You take one of anyone we've ever met and we will come back for every last one. It was not policy. It was not strategy. It was not even fully a decision. It was just what they were. The stars streaked past the viewport as the drive kicked in and 7 Delta fell away behind them, and Sergeant Amara Cole allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that felt like fire in her chest. Then she started writing her after-action report. There were always more people to find. What humanity left behind. The report took 3 days to compile. This was not because the facts were complicated. The facts were, in the way of truly catastrophic events, almost insultingly simple. In a single night, a period of approximately 14 of Varith Prime's standard time units, 47 detention facilities across the Vorkai interior network had been simultaneously compromised. Guard systems disrupted. Cell locks overridden. Prisoners extracted. 1,142 prisoners. Gone. The report was 3 days late because no one in the upper command structure wanted to be the one to sign it. High Executor Mora reviewed it in her private chamber at the apex of the throne spire, the highest point of the tallest structure on Varith Prime, a place from which one could, on clear days, see the curve of the world. She found this perspective useful for maintaining the illusion of control. Today it was not useful. She read the report twice. Then she set it aside and spent a long time looking at the wall, which was covered in the bioluminescent mapping of Vorkai territorial holdings. Centuries of expansion, absorption, consolidation, represented in the cool blue light of achievement. The humans had been in their records for less than 30 standard cycles. Less than a generation in Vorkai terms. A peripheral species from a single-system civilization, technologically mid-range, politically fragmented, biologically unremarkable. The preliminary intake assessments had categorized them as moderate-value information sources and low-priority strategic concerns. They had never been designated a threat. There had been no reason to designate them a threat. The Vorkai designated threats based on military capacity, territorial proximity, and demonstrated hostility. Humanity had none of the first in meaningful quantity, limited of the second, and had displayed the third only in response to being shot at, which Mora privately acknowledged was a somewhat weak basis for threat assessment. What they had failed to designate, what they had no category for, was this. She activated the holographic reconstruction of the event timeline. 47 concurrent insertions. The synchronization was extraordinary, tighter than most Vorkai military operations could achieve, and the Vorkai had been coordinating military operations for 400 years. The intelligence behind it was even more extraordinary. Patrol schedules. Structural vulnerabilities. Lock override codes. Interior schematics. They had known everything. They had built this knowledge from inside the facilities themselves. Mora thought about the prisoner from the Zephyr incident, the human Commander Novak, female, diplomatic designation, held at Kareth Station for 11 months. She had filed unremarkable behavioral reports. Compliant. Quiet. Observant. Observant. That word sat in Mora's processing centers like a stone. The preliminary investigation had also uncovered something that disturbed her more than the extraction itself, the scope of the cooperation. The humans had not done this alone. They had operated through an existing network, a covert communication and coordination infrastructure that had been quietly functioning within the Vorkai interior for an estimated 2 centuries. 2 centuries. Mora's people had controlled the Selhari for 300 years. They had studied them, processed their data, categorized their capabilities and limitations with the thoroughness that defined Vorkai administrative practice. They had categorized sanitation workers as beneath information-gathering concerns. They had categorized communications technicians as low strategic value assets. They had categorized the entire support infrastructure of their tributary populations as background, as infrastructure, as things that processed but did not think. And for 200 years those things had been thinking, talking, building, waiting. The humans had found the network in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. A prisoner in a ventilation gap conversation with a terrified Selhari technician. 3 weeks of careful, patient, species-transcendent communication. And then they had come back. Mora pressed her upper limbs flat on the desk surface, a Vorkai gesture of forced calm, and made herself think clearly. The military response options were being prepared by the Strategic Command. She had read those proposals too. They were thorough. They involved significant force. They would, on paper, be effective at preventing any similar incursion. She did not think they would work. The Vorkai understood deterrence through superior force. It was the foundational logic of their entire expansion model. You demonstrated overwhelming capacity, and other species made rational calculations about the cost of resistance. It had worked consistently for 4 centuries. It worked on species that calculated cost. The humans had sent volunteers. Self-selected individuals who understood the risk and accepted it and went anyway. Not because they calculated that the benefit outweighed the risk, but because they did not appear to experience the choice as a calculation at all. They experienced it as an imperative. As something owed. You could not deter an imperative with force. The Vorkai had discovered this, belatedly and painfully, with the early Selhari resistance. They had suppressed it with sufficient brutality that the resistance went underground, and apparently stayed there for 200 years, waiting. The humans had not gone underground. The humans had sent a message. It arrived formally through the Xeno-diplomatic channel 48 hours after the extraction. Mora read it in the same quiet chamber, in the same high tower, and the bioluminescent territory maps on the walls had never looked less impressive. The message was from Admiral James O'Say, United Earth Federation Combined Command. It was short. It said, "We have recovered our people and the people they were held with. We have documented the conditions of every facility we accessed. This documentation has been shared with the Galactic Community Observer Corps and with the representatives of every species whose citizens we extracted. We are not seeking war. We are stating clearly, we will come back for anyone else you take. Any person. Any species. Any location. We will find them and we will bring them home. This is not a threat. This is a description of what we are." The final line read, "We suggest you find a different economic model." Mora set the message down. Around her, the staff waited for her orders. They waited for the measured, strategic, thoroughly Vorkai response that would reassert the logic of dominance and the price of crossing territorial sovereignty. She was going to have to disappoint them. Because she had read that final line several times and she had come to understand, with the clarity of someone who had spent 4 centuries believing that power was the only language that mattered, that the humans were not speaking power. They were speaking something older and more fundamental than power. Something her people had optimized away centuries ago in the name of efficiency. They were speaking, "This is who we are and we will not stop being it." You could not conquer that. You could not deter it or suppress it or administer it into something manageable. You could only choose whether to keep provoking it or to stop. Mora spent a long time looking at the territorial map. At 4 centuries of blue light. Then she called for her senior diplomatic staff. The military response proposals would go in a drawer. She had a different kind of communication to draft. And perhaps, if she was very careful and very honest, and prepared to revise 400 years of administrative assumption, a different kind of future to negotiate. She did not know if the humans would accept it. She suspected, based on everything she had just learned about them, that they would evaluate it seriously and make their decision based not on what was strategically optimal but on what was right. Which meant she was going to have to figure out what right looked like. For the first time in her long career, Mora, High Executor of the Vorkai Dominion, found herself thinking that this was going to require a fundamentally different kind of intelligence report. One she would have to learn how to write. Far across the dark between stars, 1,142 people breathed free air. Among them, scratching names into a notebook rather than a wall, a habit she could not seem to break, Commander Sasha Novak added one final entry. Every last one she wrote. She closed the notebook. She looked out at the stars. She smiled.